Good morning and welcome to Train Shed Tuesdays. I'm going to talk a little bit about this layout today. I've done most of the work on it and a little bit about some of the locos and also about the people and the personalities on it because I've added 15 people now to the layout which I've all hand painted. I also went to a very good model railway exhibition at Robertsbridge Sunday, talk a little bit about that. It's not going to be one of the longer ones this morning. I've been busy doing other projects, so not a lot of railway stuff done, although this has taken quite a bit of time to get right. So I guess we'll talk about this first, if I just run this in. So that's the old Daypole Park Royal rail bus. I really wanted a little rail bus, and the Helgen and that sort of things were well over £100. And obviously the kit's about 10 quid. It does show its age, it needs a bit of work. Motorising it in the end was not as difficult as I thought it would be, and there's videos on this if you go back through. But this is the Lima, well, HO they called it, but it was very big for HO, freelance shunter, but it's the centre cab one that actually are a little bit rarer and harder to get hold of. But the advantage is that the wheelbase is not massively wrong for one of these. As you can see, this is the longer one, not the little tiny one that most people know that was really a motor bogie. You cut a hole in the underframe, you fit the motor in. The side plates here, you shorten slightly till the axle boxes are in line with the wheels. And it actually runs not too bad. But the whole thing probably cost me 30 quid. There we go. And that gives me a chance. So this is, I don't often like Americanisms, sorry folks, but somebody in America gave me this term of fiddlestick, which I think is a really good term for this idea of just a straight of track. Now, I did want to put a point in there, and I will do at some point. Oh dear, pun intended. But I haven't got a spare one at the moment, so I'm just using a single one. But that works quite nicely. This is all very jerry-rigged at the moment. I've got the controller there with a cardboard packing, so I could screw it into the board without the screws coming through the other side. The reason for that is I've got some ideas of making this possibly into a all-in-one kind of cabinet exhibition layout. But what I want to do first is practice shunting with it and seeing how well it's going to work. I have to say the 00 tension lock couplings are nowhere near as easy to use as the N-Gage Arnold couplings. I have experimented with removing a hook. Again, this is all in an earlier video. Cutting the actual, that hooky bit, taking the actual horizontal hook off, because one of the problems is if they're under tension they won't uncouple with a uncoupling hook. Now that's fine in a big layout, you can bang everything together and unhook it, but in a little layout it's making it a bit jerky trying to get the wagons in the right place. Now interestingly, I've seen a few manual uncouplers and magnetic uncouplers, and the interesting thing is people again are having a terrible job getting the wagon in the right place. So I'm still quite happy that uncoupling hooks are the way to go. But I want to see if I can adapt the 00 wagons to uncouple easily. Because if I do exhibit this, then one of the secondary functions is always to say to people, would you like to have a go at shunting? And if that's fiddly or it needs practice, and I accept with practice it's possible to get it working quite nicely, same as N-Gage, I'm not sure. So that's all up in the air at the moment. Interestingly, I mentioned I was at the Robertsbridge show, which was the Rother Valley Railway. I'm just going to put this on the tripod for a minute while I natter. So the Rother Valley Railway at Robertsbridge, quite interesting. It's really an offshoot of the Kent and East Sussex Railway. When they started the Kent and East Sussex Railway, they had an agreement that they wouldn't go to Robertsbridge for all sorts of reasons. But ultimately, that's what they wanted to do. So what they did was they formed another railway called the Rother Valley Railway at Robertsbridge, because there's no restriction on them joining the Kent and East Sussex Railway. So the plan has always been to work, if you like, from both ends. So I'm just fiddling with something here while I talk. To work from both ends, to meet in the middle. And the railway will then go from Tenterden to Robertsbridge. Robertsbridge is important because there's a mainline railway station there. And so they're trying to do effectively what the Bluebell did by connecting to East Grinstead. I think they brought 10,000 extra visitors a year. But it means you can go by train. And what was fascinating was the support that this Rother Valley Railway got from Kent Tourism, Kent County Council, the National Trust, because the railway goes near to Bodiam Castle. And they all jumped on board and said, this is a really good idea because it means you can get from London into Kent by rail without having to use your car. So although there was objections to them crossing the A21, they've managed to get a level crossing approved now across the A21, largely because the reason you get a long wait at level crossings is it has to allow for the longest, slowest train to be able to stop. So on some main lines, that's why the barriers are down for a long time. They're running a 4-coach train at 20 miles an hour, so they don't need a big stopping distance. So actually the gates won't be down for very long. So they've got planning permission, and I think it's next year they intend then to have the trains all the way through. And they're building a new station building at Robertsbridge. It's really quite exciting. And it was a good little show. Only a few layouts, but very nice. And most importantly for me, I got to speak to Ian, who I've met before and I know, who does the excellent layouts in a suitcase, sort of briefcase sort of thing. But he is now the organiser for the Bluebell show. And some of you will know I mentioned we always used to exhibit at the Bluebell. In fact, several years we ran a sub-show, a budget model railway show at the Bluebell. But the organisers changed and we never got contacted again. Ian is now a very good organiser, and he's now been brought in to do the organising of the shows. So we have been invited to exhibit at the Bluebell show in 2026. So I want to put some thought into it. However, this is a really nice layout. It's a great looking layout. I'm very pleased with it. Let's talk a little bit about the figures. I'm just going to take the camera off. So these are Daypole figures that I have painted myself. Painting figures actually is not as difficult as some people might make out, like most things with model railways. You basically paint the colours on you want, going a few shades lighter than you need. And then I simply black wash and dry brush. And that brings all the detail out. Use matte paints. One of my big bugbears, and I saw this on an article once in Continental Modeller, was somebody using gloss paints. Clothing, unless you're into a lot of PVC and leather, missus, is not shiny. So you need to use matte paints. But these figures are very good. I quite like him, so he's working the point lever. So I've actually got somebody working the points. And I always like a few personalities around my figures. So you've got Bill and Bert there looking at the motorbike. Somebody's brought that home from World War II. It's a Zundap, German bike. I imagine getting spares for that is quite hard. And Bob's leaning on it as if it's his, but it's not actually his. It's Tony's in the flying helmet there, walking back up to the locker room. Now, the thing is, Bill and Bob didn't talk to Terry much about Terry. I can't remember what I said his name was. Let's say it's Tony. About his motorbike, because he's only a whippersnapper and they don't want him getting ideas above his station by being too familiar with him. Little do they know that Tony is doing the management programme. So within a few years, they will find he's telling them what to do. And they won't be over happy about that. Tucked away in there, I can't really photograph it, but is a figure doing what you do in a urinal. I really wanted to do that. And I found a figure that was working a tool, like a pneumatic drill. So I cut the pneumatic drill off because it means his hands are in the right place. And he's in there doing what you do in a urinal. We've then got our guys working in the warehouse. So the foreman there and his mate are talking about where they're going to put some of the stuff. And he's over there unlocking the warehouse, ready to store it all away. And then over here, we've got our little hall. This is the factory hall. So the services for this are timetabled, but not on the public timetable, because it's really just for the people in and out of the power station and colliery that's here, which is what the line services. And there are a lot of those in existence. And interestingly, I found a wonderful book on one of the branches in Essex, one of the short branches when I was at the show. And some of the platforms there were between 10 feet and 25 feet long. So anybody that wants to say that this platform is too short, as in most things, there is a prototype justification. So we got a few people here. We got Mabel. Mabel walking, this is the changeover in shifts, so she works in the canteen. And I called her Mabel because dressed like that, she reminds me of my old gran. And she's walking along there and she won't be very impressed by Beryl. Beryl's a bit showy, isn't she? She's got the Doris Day blonde hair and the matching beret and skirt and red paint and shoes. And red paint and shoes are very frowned upon. I worked for a very traditional retailer, shoe retailer in the 1980s. And the older staff then were still very dismissive of paint and shoes and red paint and shoes. Only certain sorts of girls wore that, if you know what I mean. Beryl doesn't care. She's going out with Tony, so she's had her hair done. Mabel, of course, won't approve. Beryl's the sort of girl that was far too familiar with the Americans during the war, while her Bernard was off with the 14th Army, the Forgotten Army in Burma. And unfortunately, Bernard didn't come home. And unfortunately, the Forgotten Army are likely to continue to be forgotten. We've done quite rightly all the VE Day commemorations, but I wonder if we'll do as much for VJ Day, or if the 14th Army will be the Forgotten Army again. My own gran actually had quite an interesting story. She'd worked in the War Office in London in World War I, which of course she found wonderful, as did all the women that found themselves able to work, but had to go back to being a wife and a mother after the First World War. Interestingly, her own husband, who joined the Royal Army Service Corps, was invalided out of the army and later died of TB on the Isle of Wight when my father was 13. So in fact, I didn't know my grandfather, and my father passed away before my son was born, so he didn't know his grandfather either. The interesting thing was my father was always told he'd got TB because he'd been gassed in the First World War. But in fact, when my parents were still alive, they got hold of his military records and he'd been invalided out for poor eyesight. But of course, TB had a stigma, social stigma in the 1930s. So I imagine my gran told her young son that his father had TB because he'd been gassed, and it made a better story. Interestingly, she then had a young son to bring up on her own, and her brother-in-law had lost his wife and had a young son. And they ended up being, if you like, housekeeper. She ended up being housekeeper for him. But because that would have been frowned upon, they eventually got married. So she ended up marrying two brothers and kept the same surname. So the person I knew as my grandfather was actually my great step-uncle. Stepfather and uncle. Great uncle. So he's my great uncle, my stepfather, and who I knew as my grandfather. Just noted I've got a huge spider trapped in the insulation between my window, and I don't like spiders. Their brother, though, interestingly, was a standard bearer to Earl Haig in the First World War. And we still have his diary from 1914, which makes interesting reading. Although we've never been able to get anybody in any of the museums or that kind of thing interested in it, which is a shame, because it's a diary from 1914 when the war was quite different. And he was alongside Earl Haig. In fact, if you ever find a photograph, there's quite a common photograph of Haig called Haig with the Canadians, and he's on a horse. And if you ever see a photo of Haig on a horse, 9 times out of 10, the guy behind him carrying the standard is my great uncle. And then that figure there, that's Mike. That's the sales rep. And he's been to the factory and warehouse to sell something. It was a good sale. He likes the buyer. But unfortunately, it's a bit of a difficult one because, of course, in those days, he wouldn't have had a car. He'd have to go everywhere by train. And he's looking at the timetable, hoping that one of the trains will get him home in time at a sensible time. And that obviously makes me think of me and all my years repping. So there we go. There's stories behind the people. When you make a layout, I think it's nice to give it some personality. And one way to do that is to have some figures and to have a bit of a story behind the figures. So I'm pleased with the layout. I've got to do a bit of work to make it run quite so smoothly as I like. But it is part of the challenge. that's going exceptionally well. There's 3 or 4 videos now floating on the internet talking about the challenge. And I've still got this one to work on. So this is much more ambitious. This is a loop with 3 sidings in N-gauge. I've recently picked this up cheap. It's a little 2-platform tram station, which will fit in there. And it might get me going again on that particular layout. And I'm having a bit of a pause before I make any more layouts. I think I need to decide what it is I want to do. I've got enough N-gauge layouts to play with. I've got my 00, and I've got the beginnings of 3 or 4 other layouts. But what I really ought to be doing is clearing this bench and starting on the main N-gauge shed layout. I think that's what I need to do. It's been great fun doing all these little layouts, and I think that is the way to go. But really, I ought to try and do my big layout. So I have got a home under the bench for the Japanese layout. That can go away. But I might leave that until after I've finished exhibiting it in July the 5th. Pevensey Model Railway Club, look it up. And we are exhibiting there on July the 5th. And that's probably the only other show this year. So I am going to give it some thought. I probably do need to start working on that layout. Anyway, a big thank you to everybody that's been doing the challenge. Seems to have got people's imagination fired up. We'll see what I get up to in the next week. We've got quite a few big projects on. We've got to go and get Doug at the weekend, get him back from uni and get him ready moved to go up to his placement in Cheltenham. So I might do a train shed Tuesday. I might not. If you don't hear from me, it's because I haven't really got much railways done because we've got a lot of prep to do to do those moves. I do like that layout. It's a lovely freelance layout. It's got everything, stations, sidings, and I might use that a little bit in the next few days as well. I might try and get some trains running videos up. I know people like those. So I hope you're enjoying your model railways, and thank you as always for watching.